Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today I'm quilting block number 5 with spirals, feathers, and sharp stippling. But first, let's learn how to stitch in the ditch. This is a pretty complex block, so let's start by stitching in the ditch to get all of the layers nice and stable. So I've basted up my block and I am stitching in the ditch, and there is a lot of ditches in this quilt, and I just wanted to discuss how I'm stitching in the ditch and the path that I'm choosing for this block. So you can see I am just carefully stitching down with my walking foot, trying to stay right in the seam line between those pieces. And I do press my seam allowances open and I stitch right in the ditch. And I think that's perfectly fine. I've never seen that create an issue for any of my quilts. I do piece with a short stitch length, so I think that that really helps. I always piece with a 1.5 millimeter stitch length. So whenever you're working with your walking foot, you always have to rotate the quilt in order for it to face the direction that you're stitching in. And so it's pretty much just kind of a start and stop process. As you come to a place where the direction changes, you stop with the needle in the down position and rotate the quilt and then start stitching again. It's not hard, but it is slow. So it's one of those things that you just need to slow down and take your time on. So how I'm going to stitch this block in the ditch is I'm going to work around the center flower shape and back down to the vase. Then I'll stitch over and I'll stitch that side flower, work my way down and around the bottom of the vase itself. From there, I'll probably stitch in the ditch all the way around the block, between the block background and border, and then come up around the opposite side of the vase and stitch around this opposite flower, this other side flower, and then I'll end right where I began. So that's the path that I've decided to do, and that's how I'm going to be securing this block, so that way I can take all of the pins out and it'll be really easy to free motion quilt. So I'll meet you back here when this block is completely stitched in the ditch and we're ready to start free motion quilting. So I got started in this block on the stem, stitched up, swirled inside the flower for a spiral, and then now I'm stitching back down that stem. And this is free motion quilting, so I've popped my Supreme slider over the feed dogs, I've lowered my stitch length to 0, and I'm just stitching this by guiding, by pushing the quilt with my hands. So I'm going to push it back to swirl into that other leaf shape, just stitching right on these marked lines. And I did mark these designs, the spiral and the leaf shapes, just simply because I wanted them to come out just exactly the way I designed them in the pattern. I did not mark the background design. We're going to quilt sharp stippling in the background, and I didn't mark that simply because I wanted to be able to freehand it. That's quilting without marks. So I'm going to go into that next. And I'm going to use sharp stippling to kind of help me move through the quilt. It's going to help me get over to this area. I'm only going to do a little bit of it. And so how I'm able to freehand this is because I've memorized the rules of the design. So sharp stippling is kind of come to a wiggly point, then form a wiggly point in another direction. Just continue to wiggle around, come to a sharp point, and then wiggle back. It's almost an echo, but or kind of flame shapes is another way to think about it too. So I used that sharp stippling to connect over here, and I'm going to fill in this second leaf and flower shape. So I'm going to roll up the block here so that way it's out of my way, and then stitch up that stem. And the cool thing is these designs connect, they interconnect, so I can go straight into the flower spiral. So for this spiral, I want to spread out my hands a little bit so that way I can make that continuous shape without having to shift my hands around. I find that if I can just leave my hands in one position and not do a lot of fiddling, usually my spiral will come out a little bit better, a little bit cleaner and closer to the marked lines than if I try stopping, starting, rotating, doing a lot of fiddly stuff. That's why I kept the spiral relatively small. So I'm coming into the center, swirling around, and now I'm working my way back out again. And the interesting thing is I always find working from the inside out of a spiral to just feel a little bit more natural.
probably because you have a lot of things to look at as you're working your way outward. You know, visually you can kind of break up the space, like here's my line and here's the edge of the flower shape. I'm kind of stitching right in the middle of that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm stitching right on my marked line, but that's okay. That line will be erased. I can erase that after the quilt is done, and no one will know that I meant to hit something that I didn't hit. So that's how I'm going to quilt all of the flowers and leaf shapes within this quilt. So I've stitched some sharp stippling over in the background to get to this edge of the vase, and now I want to fill it in with this feather design. So I'm going to get started first by stitching the center vein. This is kind of the baseline of any feather, and the nice thing is we have a really nice big vase for this block. So we have a really big feather to fill in here and lots of room to expand this design. It's going to be a lot of fun. So the first step is just to stitch the starting line. So I'm going to stitch that corner to corner, and then I want to rotate the block around so I can see what I'm doing as I echo back and stitch the line that runs parallel with this. So I'm going to roll up the block and get it manageable. Never hesitate to just stop with your needle in the down position and get your block situated where you want it to go. That is never a waste of your time. It's actually always a good use of your time, because the more natural and easy it feels to quilt your block, the better your stitches are going to look. So now I'm stitching down along that opposite line and trying to stay right on it, because I want this center stem to be really big. You know, a nice wide center stem really sets off a big feather like this. I think it's going to look really good. Okay. As you can see, I stop and start a lot just to make sure that I stay on the line and I can see what I'm doing. And then also, it's so big that I have to reposition my hands too, just so that I have good control over the quilt. Okay, so that is the center stem stitched. Now I'm going to branch out with my feathers, and this time I'm going to go over all the different types of feathers again. The kind that I really prefer are travel back feathers. So you travel back along the back side of the feather, swirl out and back down. So really the motion and movement of this shape is identical with each feather. So you're always making the same motion, the same movement. That's why I like it. It also puts the travel stitching in the same spot every time. So that's why I like it. There's another way to do a feather though. You can just simply form the feather shape. So that's going to be feather number 1, then travel stitch along the stem, then stitch the next feather, and you're going to bump backwards. So this is a bump bump feather. I'm bumping back. Now I'm going to bump forward. I'm going to stitch along that again, and this time I'm going to bump forward, out and around to form that next feather. So the next step would be stitch along the stem, form that next feather, bump back, and then bump forward again. I don't like this as much just simply because I always forget which step I'm on. You know, it's not as repetitive as the other one. And I struggle to remember what step I'm on, and then I also don't like that the travel stitching is kind of inconsistent. So sometimes you have travel stitching here, sometimes you have travel stitching on the stem. So another way that you can form feathers, let's see here, I gotta think through it. You know, it's one of those things, I get used to my habits, you know, and you know, it's very tricky to kind of think back through that. So this is kind of a forward back feather, so you're going to stitch down on the stem to the next feather design. You're going to stitch out and swing back and then travel along the back of the feather before. So it's kind of almost the same thing as the travel back feather, only in a different direction. Instead of swirling outward, you're swirling inward, and that might be all it takes to make it feel natural for you. You know, it's one of those funny things. I think feathers are one of those things that you really have to just try it in a lot of different ways to see what works best. So I'm going to go back to my favorite, which are travel back feathers. I'm going to travel along the back of that, swirl out and around to form that design. And watch out for seam allowances. Just because, you know, we're quilting doesn't mean that seam allowance isn't going to impact what you're doing. So anytime that you see a line, a seam allowance, like right here, just be aware that that might impact your foot, and it might impact also your nice, smooth, curving feather shape. And you might have to push a little harder on the quilt as you stitch over those seam allowances in order to keep it going smoothly. So just keep that in mind too. Now, as the feathers get a little smaller, honestly, you just need to make sure that you're staying on the line. You're maintaining a nice consistent stitch length. And stitch length is always a combination of the speed of your hands moving and the speed of your machine running, so the needle bouncing up and down. So really, when you're working on something small, the best thing to do is just simply slow down. You know, as I'm forming these smaller shapes, I'm stitching at a slower rate, a slower speed, and that helps me maintain really good control. I also stitch slower when I'm travel stitching as well, and that helps a lot too. Coming in for these last few feathers. And here's the other cool thing about feathers is that they're very directional. So if I was to travel stitch down the stem and start stitching the feathers this way, that would be virtually the opposite direction and the opposite feel of the set that we've just done. And I don't like to do that. So what I'm going to do is travel stitch along the stem all the way back to the beginning and form my feathers from the beginning, kind of curling upward to the end. Oop, watch out for those seam allowances. So I'm going to do this travel stitching and then form those opposite feathers the exact same way. You don't have to do this. I want you to know that this is something that I do just simply because that's the way I like to quilt it. And I want you to take the time while quilting this block to figure out what you like to do and what your favorite method is. Other options that you could do, instead of travel stitching down, you could fill the center vein with circles. I call that chain of pearls, and that looks really beautiful in the center of a feather. You could fill this area with lines, so you could stitch right down the middle of it to get back down to the center, to the beginning. Lots of different options here. Be really creative and enjoy stitching these nice big feather shapes. Next, I want to show you just a little bit more sharp stippling and how I'm going to use this to fill in the background of the block. Now, your path is going to be a little bit different if you mark the design on your block, and that's just fine. Really, I want to just show you how you can freehand this, meaning quilt without marks, and just kind of wiggle through the area in a really free-form way, and also be looking at where you're going. So through here, I wanted to fill that space in completely and be able to kind of escape through that little space. And so whenever I'm forming a design, I'm always looking at how I can stitch the shapes and ultimately move me in the right direction while also filling in the space completely so I don't leave gaps in the design. Now, it's not a big deal if you do leave gaps. You can just break thread, go back, and fill it in later. But this is one of those things that's just a skill for free motion quilting, to try and fill things in as much as you can as you work through any particular area. So here I kind of worked to this leaf first. I filled in with a few lines through here, then I bounced over here and filled in with a few lines, and now I'm going to tuck through and escape through that little space, all the while stitching a wiggly line that occasionally comes to a sharp point. So wiggle over, and it's almost a flame shape. That's really the kind of the aim that I'm going for, is just a wiggly, curvy, very fluid flame shape. So now I've escaped from that area. And when it comes to scale, this is the thing that can be tricky whenever you're quilting and kind of having to squeeze into tight areas like this. Your lines of quilting might become a little closer together, and that's okay. It's okay if it gets just a little bit closer together, a little bit denser. Overall, the block is not going to be super dense, so it's not going to be a big deal. So here I'm quilting down, and I think I'm going to quilt down between the two flowers so I knock out that area as well. I know I'm going to come to a dead end because there's not room to stitch in there and then also escape, and that's okay. So I'm going to go in and look for the best possible place to kind of dead end my stitching, and I'll break thread and then pull up thread somewhere else. No big deal. So I'm working my way into the area, going back to stitch a sharp point. I think I'm going to flow in this direction first. Just gentle wiggling around, and I'll kind of tuck down into that stem, fill that area in. And it looks like I've got this narrow space, and then I've also got this area to fill as well. And I'm just kind of just acknowledging, you know, what's going on and what the best place to go. I just dead end and right here against that leaf shape. I'm going to travel stitch up. This is the other thing. You're absolutely allowed to travel stitch anytime that you need to in any design. You know, you can always use that. Just run up against a ditch and travel stitch to get out to another area and finish your line. So here I just filled that in with a few more lines, ran up right against that stem, and I'm happy with that. In fact, actually, I think I can keep going. I'm going to travel stitch along this stem, and I'm going to escape through the top of that flower, just like that. Now I can go back to sharp stippling and fill in this opposite side. So I'm going to wiggle over, and then I have sharp stippling filled in right here. So I'm just going to line this up and kind of match it up with the opposite side, so it almost looks like, well, it does look completely continuous and not as though I've quilted one section earlier or one section later. It just looks like one continuous design running through that background area. And I'll bring it up here, match up with where I started, and that whole section will be completely filled and complete. It's one of those things that just takes practice. To do this freehand requires really getting to know the design, and for sharp stippling, I've stitched this many, many times. So I know the design really well. I know where it works really well in these tight, fine areas around these flowers. And I also know that I can kind of wiggle it around and get it to do what I want it to do. And anytime that I have a space, like a gap that I've missed, I can just travel stitch down and tuck in that area with just a little wiggly flame shape, and that's all it needs. So just a little wiggle, come to a point, come back down, and that area is nicely filled. So that's how to fill sharp stippling in the background. Please understand, if this seems really intimidating or challenging for you, just mark it and stitch on the mark lines instead. The last step to quilting our blocks is always this little rainbows design. So we're going to start by stitching a little arch shape. This time I'm trying to quilt this from the center to the outside edges, just to show you what that looks like. So I quilted the smallest arch first, and then travel stitched over, quilt the next one. Now I'm travel stitching again and forming this third ring. So this is one of those things that also you just kind of have to play with it and see what works best for you. For me, stitching it from the center doesn't necessarily feel very natural, but as you can see, I can do it. I just ended up wobbling a little bit on that third round. I'm a little off the line, but I'm not going to stop and rip it out. I'm going to leave it. Now I want to form this corner circle shape. And I like to build up thread here. I just really like those corners to stand out nicely. So I swing around once, and then I travel stitch around on top of it. And it's okay if you end up like not stitching perfectly on the line. You can always go around again, throw more thread at it, and fix any mistakes. So now I'm going to fill in that area with a little spiral. And this is pretty tight stitching, and this is a closed spiral, meaning I'm going to spiral all the way into the center, and then I'm going to slowly travel stitch my way all the way back out again. This is really good practice for both echoing and travel stitching, both of those techniques are really important for free motion quilting. Once you master echoing and travel stitching, you can pretty much do anything you want, and I really hope that that helps you practice. And here's what it looks like whenever you finish block number 5. So that's it for this video. I really hope that you enjoyed learning how to quilt all of these designs with me today. If you have any questions about quilting block number 5, definitely ask in the comments below. I'm here to help you learn more about quilting.
If you'd like to find the pattern for this block, you can check it out at leahday.com/blockparty. Until next time, let's go quilt!